This is an introduction to the IB area of exploration known as intertextuality. So in IB, there are three areas of exploration. The first one is an exploration of the nature of interaction between readers, writers, and texts. The second area is an exploration of how texts interact with time and space. And the third area is an exploration of intertextuality, how texts connect with one another. So this area of exploration has origins, and it was developed by a postmodernist theorist, a French philosopher, Julia Kristeva, in the late 1960s. So she theorized that texts are connected, related, or influence one another. And she also questioned the idea of originality, truth, and authenticity because people's ideas are usually inspired by those of others. So, what is intertextuality? Loosely defined, intertextuality is the shaping of a text's meaning by the reading of other texts or the relationship of texts. It refers to instances in which a text's meaning, so this can be a story, a book, article, art, song, video, a movie, is influenced by another text. And these types of references can be subtle or they can be obvious. So the key idea is that these references allow for a deeper understanding of the texts. And intertextual thinking can also be looking at patterns of events across stories or looking at how authors have chosen to convey ideas about the same topic in different ways or across different time periods. So interdefined, we're just going to break this down a little bit. It's a prefix that means between or among, as in the word international, and it also means together, mutually, or reciprocally. And then textual, when we see the word textual, so text in language and literature course is defined as anything that carries meaning. And we can consider text as part of a discourse. Discourse obviously is a process resulting in a communicative act. So overview of text. So when we think of text, again in language and literature, it's defined as anything that carries meaning. So this can encompass novels, plays, poems, short stories, and even nonfiction. Text, in a visual sense, can be works of like popular art, as you see here. It can be songs, song lyrics. Text can also be works of famous paintings. It can be advertisements, or text can be, again, visual, so it can be film as well, too. And all of these areas here define what we are looking at as text in the area of exploration known as intertextuality. So an analogy, to think of this idea of intertextuality simply, it's basically the idea of text within a text. So I like to think of the movie Inception. It came out in 2010. Basically, it's a dream within a dream. So for comparison purposes, I'm using this movie. What happens is Leonardo DiCaprio, he's a thief with this rare ability to enter people's dreams and steal their secrets from their subconscious. So the idea of dream within a dream in Inception is equated with the text within a text, making that analogy as a comparison point. Now, of course, we have to look at stylistic techniques because we always examine text through the lens of stylistic techniques. So we'll be looking at the intertextual nature of text through this lens. And there's four main ones that go with intertextuality. The first one is allusion. And we're going to review allusion again. So allusion can be anything that comes from the Bible, mythology, literary or cultural references. Oftentimes these come from the past. The second stylistic technique that applies to intertextuality is known as appropriation. And appropriation basically is text that has been adapted, reimagined, or made new. And then a pastiche is basically, it's a French, or I'm sorry, it's an Italian word for paste. It's a collage of words that create a new literary work. And then the last one is a parody. So the word parody is a funny imitation of a serious piece of literature, writing, art, or music. So I will be breaking down these four stylistic techniques and how they apply to this area of exploration known as intertextuality. So the first one we're going to look at is appropriation. So appropriation, loosely defined, is basically borrowing from another text. It's an adaptation. So the old becomes something new. Think of it as reusing or reinterpreting or reimagining. So I'm going to show you what all of this looks like. So if you look at the screen, obviously you see different renditions or different interpretations of Cinderella. This is known as appropriation. So you have the original story of Cinderella, then you have the original Disney version, which came from the original Cinderella. Then you have the film, The Cinderella Story, which came out in the 90s with Hilary Duff and Chad Michael Murray. Then you have another version of a film with Drew Barrymore and Angelica Houston, Ever After. It's another Cinderella story. And then recently, Disney came out with another version called Happily Never After. And then we have another version of Disney Cinderella. So these are examples, right? It's been reinterpreted, reimagined over time. This is what it means to have appropriation. All right. Another example of appropriation, we're going to cross genres here. We are looking at drama first. So drama took taking a look at The Taming of the Shrew by William Shakespeare as drama. And then a film that is kind of based on The Taming of the Shrew is 10 Things I Hate About You. And then recently there was a TV series out, wasn't as successful, called 10 Things I Hate About You. So this is how genres can cross over, how we can reimagine something that came from Shakespeare, turn it into a film, and then TV. All right, so we're going to look at intertextuality and illusions. And when we look at illusions, there's four ways to look at them. So you can look at illusions in a literary sense. There are mythological illusions, biblical illusions, and then also historical or cultural illusions. And I will be breaking down each one to show you how that looks like in an intertextual context. All right, so the first one is literary illusions. So we have Taylor Swift's Love Story. And if anyone is familiar with Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, Taylor Swift's Love Story album is alluding to this famous play. It's a reimagined version of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And then if we look at the lyrics, you can see that she is even referencing specific passages from the play. Like there's a flashback, the balcony scene. There's all these allusions that are made here. She is mentioning Romeo's name, right? To keep quiet, right? And this reference, this foreshadowing of death over here. So these lyrics are very in line with the famous love story Romeo and Juliet. So that's a literary allusion right there. Next, we have intertextuality and mythological allusions. So an example that you should be familiar with is this two-sided mythological god known as Jove, right? He represents the two-faced Iago in Shakespeare's Othello. Okay, so that's an example of mythological allusions. Next, we have biblical allusions, so allusions that come from the Bible. So we will be reading the text Frankenstein in year 2 of IB. And Frankenstein has all kinds of biblical allusions in it. So it's a Gothic novel. It alludes to the creation story and the good and evil that come from the Bible. So that's just an example of biblical allusions. Now, cultural allusions, something that you recently read, Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, had two famous cultural or historical allusions. And I call these cultural allusions because they do relate to the Native American culture. So the one up on top is the famous Trail of Tears. Okay, so that was the Exodus and the displacement of thousands upon thousands, I should say millions, of Native Americans. The one below that, obviously, is the Middle Passage, right? The famous slave trade there. Okay, so those are cultural allusions, and writers do this all the time. All right. So the third thing we looked at in a stylistic sense is this idea of a parody. So, parody basically is a funny imitation of a serious piece of literature, writing, art, or music. It pokes fun at something to entertain the audience or reader. It is similar to satire. So, satire is something that is ridiculed to make a social or political change. So when we look at examples of parody, okay, so there's overlap here. Obviously, we know the famous Simpsons. At the top here, so this is a recreation or reimagined version of the famous Beatles cover. Down below here, we see Olaf and see a scene from Frozen represented by the Simpsons. And then finally here we have the famous painting by Edward Munch called The Scream. And Mr. Bart Simpson is depicting that as well too. So that is an example of a parody there. Now, a pastiche. This is the fourth stylistic technique that applies to intertextuality. So pastiche, this should look somewhat familiar. It's a famous Shakespearean sonnet. So if I were to ask you to write a sonnet, I would want you to imitate the original Shakespearean sonnet. And I would maybe ask you to paste ideas, forms, and words from that to make it into your own sonnet there. All right. So, a review of intertextuality. So, what we discussed was that intertextuality refers to relationships or connections between texts. It contains techniques like appropriation, allusions, parodies, and pastiche. So, the key idea is that these references allow for a deeper understanding of texts. And intertextual thinking. So, why is this so important? Why is IB focusing on this as an area of exploration? Well, it's always important to analyze patterns of events across stories. And then we analyze how authors have chosen to convey ideas about the same topic in different ways or across different time periods. So, that is the review of intertextuality. We will be focusing on this area of exploration in more depth and detail. And we will not just be looking at literary text, but visual text as well. Thank you for your attention.